Now from Texas by Scott Stewart. He's Vice President of Tactical Analysis at Stratfor. That's a global intelligence company. Scott, let me start by talking to you about the FBI. They had interviews with this suspect. They followed this suspect. And there are those wondering if they dropped the ball, and yet the FBI Director James Comey came out. He defended his agency. Can you talk to us about the challenges for law enforcement in addressing these threats?
Well, there's a couple challenges here. The first is bureaucratic, and you need to understand that in the way that the FBI works, when they open an inquiry into this kind of a case, unless they find some sort of clear indication of criminal activity during that initial stage, they have to close it down. They just can't keep things open indefinitely, and that's what appears to have happened in this case. They had looked at this the shooter twice, and they ended up closing those investigations twice. We also need to understand that overall, one of the problems that we're facing as we've seen the terrorist threat inside the United States morph from one that was based upon professional terrorist cadre from groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, to one based more on what we call these grassroots jihadis that are operating underneath this leaderless resistance model. It basically means that there's many more potential terrorists that they have to be worried about. And quite frankly, as we've seen not just in the U.S. in the past, but also in Europe, quite frequently there are just too many people for the government to monitor them all 24/7, 365. It takes a lot of resources to do that. So they have to triage the threats and focus on those they feel pose the most significant threat. And unfortunately, sometimes that assessment is incorrect, and they miss someone that did pose a threat.
Well, Scott, to your point, Comey said this. He said, we're looking for needles in a nationwide haystack and trying to figure out which pieces of hay will become needles. I mean, that really kind of puts things in perspective. He said, if we can find a way to do that better, we will. But what more possibly can they do?
Well, we need to understand, first of all, this is just, it's a very difficult problem, and it's intentional. The reasons that we saw, terrorists in the past, whether it was, white supremacists, animal liberation terrorists, and now the jihadists adopt this form of terrorism that we call leaderless resistance, is because the government in the United States has gotten very good at going after hierarchical groups. And, obviously we've seen that Al-Qaeda was not able to follow up on the attack plans that they had in the U.S. after 9/11. They kept threatening to do that. But in response to this failure, we saw the jihadists adopt this form, which basically is they try to inspire, radicalize, and then operationalize people they aren't connected with. And when the government system is one that was designed to find people connected to the terrorist group, that makes it very difficult. And so it is by design. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the threat from these professional terrorists. So really the government and the FBI needs to keep a lot of their resources also focused on trying to combat trained terrorist cadre who could be coming in from abroad that are connected with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. So it's really a very complex puzzle that they're trying to put together.
One of the things that Comey said today, and we've heard it over and over again, you see something, say something, and yet there were people who heard something, disturbed them. They did say something. He was investigated, and yet here we are today. So what about that piece of this?
Unfortunately, that's just part of life. Unfortunately, people make mistakes. Investigators make mistakes. I've certainly done it in my background as an investigator, as an analyst. I've made mistakes, and unfortunately, in this kind of a case, when an analyst or an investigator makes a bad assessment that a suspect didn't pose a threat, it can be deadly and can result in the loss of life.
The Orlando Sentinel also reporting that at least 4 regular customers at this gay bar said that they had seen this suspect at the club as many as a dozen times before the shooting spree. Add that with he's buying these weapons. Isn't there some way that law enforcement, once somebody comes on the radar, can do a periodic check back in and see what's up with this person? Is there some way to change the laws in a way where they can do that?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's going to be addressed and looked at in the wake of this case. Is there a need of a periodic review? Can we put people who've been investigated but not necessarily found to be, in criminal, can they be on some sort of a watch list? So if they go in to buy weapons, law enforcement is notified. There's certainly going to be some discussion about procedures and laws and ways that those can be adjusted. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to ask the hard questions that are being asked in this case about the suspect, about how he got the weapons, about the investigation. Sometimes the hard questions are necessary so that we can find the answers and hopefully fix problems, fix loopholes, so we won't have additional tragedies in the future.
Scott, we've seen Brussels, we've seen Paris, we've seen Orlando now, all these soft targets hit. And I have to ask you, with more setbacks on the battlefield, and we are seeing advances in Iraq, is ISIS, are we going to see more attacks in the West as a result of that they're suffering losses on the battlefield, as a result they're striking out in this way?
I don't think it's necessarily as a result of. I think they would be doing this whether or not they were losing or winning in Syria and Iraq. The thing to remember is that in the United States specifically, the attackers we're seeing are not directly connected to the Islamic State. They're motivated, inspired by the Islamic State, but they're not directly connected to them. These are people who have been motivated by the propaganda that's been, set out there by the Islamic State, and before them, Al-Qaeda. A lot of people need to remember that Al-Qaeda started promoting this form of leaderless resistance terrorism back in 2009, 2010, really before the Islamic State was even created. So this has been a long-standing issue, a long-standing problem, and unfortunately, it's the normal now. We have these grassroots terrorists. They don't have the skills of trained terrorist cadres, and so because of this, they tend to focus more on soft targets. And this is really the reality that we live in now. We have this threat of these grassroots jihadis attacking soft targets, and unfortunately, there are just too many soft targets to protect them all.
Scott Stewart joining us live from Texas. Thanks so much.